This is recorded at 3 a.m. local time, but let's give a fast and upbeat rundown on the history of the Indochina Wars. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. One person wrote to me saying that it'd be interesting to hear my perspective on these wars. It seems to me it's something I talk about all the time, but the truth is I never did make even one video focused on telling you my perspective on the history of this war. Naturally, I'm going to focus on least understood or most misunderstood elements of the war, historically, strategically, geopolitically, and even culturally. From an American perspective, the war ended in 1975. That's when the Americans start to evacuate, and then Vietnam declares its official reunification in 1976. From an Asian perspective, not from an American perspective, from the perspective of someone living in that continent, watching politics unfold in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, but also China next door, fighting didn't stop in 1975 and didn't stop in 1976 either. In many ways, the end of the war was 1979, when Vietnam was invaded by communist China. That event, for many onlookers, many of the people who were watching the politics of Vietnam unfold, many of the people who protested on one side or the other, was a huge wake-up call to the extent to which the Western world had never understood and never really even taken any interest in what the politics of Vietnam really were. When communist China invaded communist Vietnam, it revealed one of the most important geopolitical factors that had been completely consistent since 1954, that basically, to simplify a little bit, Mao Zedong and the elite levels of the Communist Party in China bitterly hated communist Vietnam. They weren't allies, they weren't friends, they weren't united against the Americans. No, quite the contrary. The relationship between Vietnam and Russia, Vietnam and China, wasn't what most people in the West thought it was, and it wasn't even what most American presidents thought it was. There isn't just the fog of war here, there's also the fog of peace. Americans went into the Vietnam War with their mentality very much prefigured by their experience in the Korean War. The Korean War ends in 1953, the same year that Joseph Stalin dies. The armistice agreement is written a few months after the death of Joseph Stalin, and these things are indeed linked. From an American perspective, I'm gesturing towards myself, I'm in fact Canadian, I'm not American. From an American perspective, the crucial factor shaping their experience of the Korean War was the entry of Chinese troops, was the Chinese support for, the Chinese backing for the North Koreans, the Korean communists. It's natural that the Americans then rolled on into the Vietnam War, imagining a somewhat similar scenario, presuming that communist China was going to support communist Vietnam. In fact, if the people in charge in the United States, the various presidents and heads of intelligence, in fact, if they'd had their eyes and ears open, they could have figured out that the stage being set for the Vietnam War was very fundamentally different in this respect, and not in this respect only. But the Americans were not really very interested in the politics of Vietnam. They weren't interested in the politics, history, and culture of Vietnam, China, Cambodia, Laos, or how they were all connected to each other. In the same way, in our own time, we can ask, to what extent was George W. Bush sincerely interested in the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan when he commenced large-scale warfare in Afghanistan? Probably not at all. Probably he could have known, it could have shaped his planning for the war. He could have known precisely what the relationship was between the Taliban and the Pakistani authorities, the Pakistani intelligence agencies, and so on. But if he could have known, he probably chose not to know, or simply put, didn't care. In the same ways, America got involved with this war with fundamentally very, very little interest in what the facts on the ground really were. Instead, America enters into the war, one, filled with optimism from their experience in Japan. Remember, in this period, the American conquest of Japan was not that long ago. And Japan is the most positive example of regime change in the history of the world. The Americans had to fight the Japanese very, very hard, very bitter combat throughout World War II. But the minute the combat was over, once the Japanese surrendered to the American side, almost overnight, the Japanese adopt a new constitution. They become a democracy. They become, in many fundamental ways, not just an American ally, but also an outstanding example of westernization, embracing economic modernity in terms of law and order, the court system, the parliament, the traffic lights, the fire hydrants. In so many ways, Japan seems to westernize and embrace capitalism and parliamentary democracy overnight. So that gave the Americans a type of optimism about what they could accomplish in conquering Vietnam that, again, is just wildly divorced from reality. And of course, they could have known how false that idea was just by studying the French experience in Vietnam, because the French had an ongoing attempt to colonize Vietnam right through World War II and thereafter, disastrously, ending with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It's a story for another video. So the Americans have optimism on the basis of their experience in Japan, and they have some trepidation based on their experience in Korea, North Korea, South Korea, the Korean War, as we call it. You could say they learned the lessons from neither of these things. But in Korea, their main problem was the Chinese army entering to support the Korean Communist Army. Okay? And their other big problem, of course, was Joseph Stalin, the Russians. Stalin dies in 1953, and really the whole context for the Vietnam War, the Indochina Wars, we should say, is created by the death of Stalin and the very peculiar optimism that took over elite levels of Russian government for at least a decade thereafter. Okay? Russia didn't want war with the United States at that time, right after the death of Joseph Stalin. Russia was not entertaining the type of strategic military options that really would have prevented the United States or would have dissuaded the United States from making Vietnam a major colonial project, shall we say. Now, what do I mean? If Joseph Stalin had kept living, which is, of course, impossible, but if Joseph Stalin had kept living for another 20 years, or if Joseph Stalin had been followed by another dictator who was identical to Joseph Stalin, the types of options that dictator would have been looking at would have been to prevent Americans having a presence in Vietnam and Indochina by moving missiles into the region. Does anyone remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? They could move missiles, whether those are nuclear missiles or not. They could move the Russian Navy into the region. It would be a very different thing if U.S. aircraft and U.S. ships were being countered by another Navy that was coming in and saying, no, we're not going to allow you to run these operations here. And, of course, they could invoke some principle of international law or some peace treaty or something. But, the American, naval presence there could have been challenged by Russia. And by the way, let's not forget, it could have in theory been challenged by another country like India also, but no one else historically in this period would have possibly challenged the American empire as it was starting to expand into Vietnam, of all places. And very nakedly, very overtly, the Americans were there expanding into the power vacuum left by the French military withdrawing. As I've mentioned in many, many videos, the French had been making money out of opium, out of heroin, and the French Secret Service handed over the heroin business to the CIA directly. Technically, it was the OSS, and then the OSS was taken over by the CIA, but in any case, even the French heroin-producing business made a direct transition from a French government of occupation to an American government of occupation with a very brutal and bloody Secret Service running that occupation. A great thing to look up to illustrate this too is Condor Island, which I think in Vietnamese is called Ton Dao Island or Con Dao Island. Condor Island, there was a horrible prison there that the French used to torture and interrogate anyone who was opposed to their regime. And that was taken over and run by the CIA, by the U.S. military, very, very. So the French legacy went directly into American hands. And without the Americans questioning it too much, not even strategically, not even in a Machiavellian sense, when you're handed the keys to a prison and torture facility, apparently you don't really question in the same way, should we come here and set up a prison and torture facility? It's bizarre but true. And I read at least one account from a survivor from Condor Island. Almost everyone sent to Condor Island was tortured and then executed. But I read an account from someone who was imprisoned there and who actually was released, who did survive. Brutal, terrible, infamous. And the effects are much more than just bad PR for the United States. For 2 generations or something, the American colonial enterprise in Vietnam totally discredited them on the world stage, for example, in the eyes of a place like India. And guys, India really matters. The intense hatred India had towards the United States of America politically. You can imagine if you're India watching from not too close and not too far away what America's doing in Vietnam during this period. You're watching these people getting tortured, and India is really wondering to what extent should they stand up, to what extent should they intervene. India largely, satisfied itself with making symbolic protests in international conferences and so on. But this had very, very far-reaching consequences for the United States of America. And of course, it, to a large extent, even discredited democracy, simply because the nature of this brutality was so terrible. And again, for the Americans, they're not questioning it seriously. They're not thinking through what they're doing. They have a positive experience with Japan. They have a negative experience with the Korean War, but they think this time in Vietnam, the same thing won't happen because Stalin is dead, basically. And then they also have this unique situation of stepping into the shoes of the French Empire after the French Empire is left. So to finish the point with Joseph Stalin, if Stalin had still been alive, or if the regime continued to be a Stalinist regime in Russia, they could have deployed missiles, they could have deployed the Navy and confronted the U.S. Navy, they could have deployed the Air Force, right? The Russians were very stingy with the Air Force in North Korea, and Mao Zedong bitterly resented that. That's part of the split, the breakdown between China and Russia. So again, most Americans at the time did not understand this. Many Americans still don't understand it today. Communist China and Communist Russia were enemies in this period. This is related to the fact that Communist China and Communist Vietnam were enemies. But anyway, theoretically, Stalin or some other Stalinist dictator could have, in the same period, deployed aerial backup to the Vietnamese. And if so, you can then imagine the American perspective on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos would change. Obviously, I'm not saying they would have completely given up, but they would then be looking at a strategic calculation and saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not free to deploy our boats and our aircraft carriers here. We're not free to just bomb this country with no Air Force opposing us. Not really a question of whether or not they can win. Of course, if the United States committed all of their resources to this war, they could win. But then they'd be looking at a very different cost calculation. And they might have been asking themselves, wait, what is it we're fighting this war for anyway? What is it we're trying to win? But those questions, I think it is fair to say, went unasked and unanswered. Just as in our own time, many of the very obvious questions, what was supposed to happen? What was the best case scenario in Afghanistan and in Iraq? I think those questions went unasked and unanswered also. So that's the American perspective. The Asian perspective is much more important. China attended an international conference in 1954, which is called the Geneva Convention of 1954. So this is after the death of Joseph Stalin, and this is shortly after peace in Korea. Technically, it's an armistice. Technically, they're still at war. Technically, there still is no peace between South Korea and North Korea. Nevertheless, we continue. At the Geneva Conventions of 1954, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the elite level of the Communist Party of China, became deeply committed to an alliance with Cambodia. And this included a close personal relationship between both of those Chinese leaders and the king of Cambodia, King Sihanouk. So in different periods of time, he has the title of king, prince, sometimes just prime minister or just leader. He actually at one point renounces the title of king and becomes a commoner. And that probably also powerfully impressed Mao Zedong. And he certainly has many years in which he's toying with both socialist and communist philosophy. And he lives for many years of his life in Beijing. And there are innumerable photographs of Sihanouk, the king of Cambodia, together with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. So they became personal friends. But the political commitment that China makes to support Cambodia starts in 1954, and it never ends. It continues to be an important factor in world politics even during the Ronald Reagan administration. It goes on and on and on. And it's also the crucial reason why China invades Vietnam in 1979. Now, there is a little bit of a chicken and egg question here. Does communist China bitterly hate communist Vietnam because China sympathized with Cambodia? China decided to support Cambodia, and basically Cambodia and Vietnam were enemies. Simplify, but it's not much of a simplification. Or is it the case that China already had this rivalry with Vietnam, already had this hatred for the Communist Party of Vietnam? Again, this is all communist versus communist struggle. And that came first. That was the basis for China cultivating this friendship with Cambodia, both a literal friendship with particular people and a strategic relationship. Doesn't matter. I mean, I actually have done enough research that I could venture a guess. But one way or another, the fundamental strategic situation that the Vietnam War unfolds on, I mean, it's exactly created by these powers. Russia, China, United States, France, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos themselves. But anyone looking back at this history from a detached perspective can say the single most important, single most decisive power here was China. That was really the political perspective that mattered. And I mean, again, especially after the death of Stalin, and given that after that, basically Russia wanted nothing to do with this part of the world. They really wanted to have as little to do with as possible with Southeast Asia. They did not want to start World War III over who would be the next government in Cambodia. That was not Moscow's perspective. And on the contrary, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai personally, the leaders in China, they were completely committed to fight however many wars were necessary to settle, as they would put it, the Cambodia issue or the Cambodia problem. So the importance of that is, again, incredibly obvious. But did Nixon care? I mean, Nixon is many, many years later. We're starting the story, we're talking about Eisenhower. Do you think Eisenhower cared? So, I mean, it's many years later we're talking about Nixon and his role in this. But in the earlier period of this history, the people at an elite level in the American politics, if they could have known this stuff, they wouldn't know. They didn't care. Anyway, the tragedy that was to unfold thereafter, again, really reflects the sort of strange optimism and lack of commitment of all of the different parties. The Russians don't really want to do anything about it. I mean, other countries in Europe, like France and Germany, really fundamentally don't care. Japan doesn't care. India doesn't care. These are all countries that could have been involved. And, yes, the United States, they did indeed propound this theory. It was actually, to my knowledge, JFK was the first guy to set it down to actually pronounce this theory, the first president of the United States to do so. The domino theory, that if they didn't stand up and stop communism from taking over Vietnam, then Thailand would be next, that communism would continue to take over the rest of Southeast Asia. And of course, this theory is bizarre, or it's a very weak form of propaganda in many ways. but it fundamentally ignores the extent to which, to quote Richard Nixon himself, China was the biggest domino of all. I mean, if you're putting China in a situation where they can or must invade and occupy Vietnam, parallel to during the Korean War, you put China in a position where they can and must invade and occupy Korea, the meaning of the American kind of colonial conquering venture in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, it starts to become meaningless just in terms of a matter of scale. If that's what you're going to force China to do, and they're going to do it, then we all know what the consequences would be for these much smaller countries in Southeast Asia. And again, imagine you're explaining this history to a space alien from Mars. Space alien is looking at this history and says, well, if France is abandoning these colonies, if France is giving up on their colonization of Indochina, and to be clear, the French were briefly replaced by the Japanese. The Japanese briefly conquered these places and to some extent set up governments for them. Japanese had stamps and postal offices for their occupation of Laos and so on. It's ridiculous, but it's true. Very briefly, the Japanese took over the government of Laos. Wouldn't it make sense, a Martian might ask, wouldn't it make sense for the next colonial power, replacing the French, replacing the Japanese, to be China? Why would it be the United States? Why would Washington, D.C. be the next colonial power to come in? So China was also, of course, looking at this whole situation with the presumption that their sphere of power, their sphere of influence would now expand. And there's no doubt, at least at a lower level of the Communist Party, there's no doubt that the death of Joseph Stalin created the expectation that China's power would expand, that Mao Zedong's personal influence would expand, precisely because he no longer had the competition of Joseph Stalin as the presumptive leader of international communism as a movement. Now, I just note, Mao Zedong himself did not see the situation that way. We know that for a fact. The paperwork is extensive. That wasn't actually his personal perspective, but of course any given journalist could see it that way, and party cadres or ordinary people most likely did see this as the period where Mao Zedong's importance was growing and China's importance was growing, whereas Russia's importance would wane or reduce. And this is also the period of the Sino-Soviet split. One other really important personal and political note. I think I mentioned earlier that China bitterly resented the fact that the Russians never really committed to provide airplanes, air support, in the Korean War. Well, guess whose son died as a result? Mao Zedong's own son, his number one son, as they say. Mao Zedong had two sons, but one of them was mentally disabled. But Mao Zedong had a son who was not mentally disabled and who was very much receiving an elite education, being prepared to become a leader of China himself. Mao Zedong had a son who was, either going to inherit the dictatorship or at least go on to be an important person in the Communist Party. And he died fighting in Korea, and nominally as well as actually, he died because the Russians let them down. The Russians didn't provide the airplanes that would have prevented the Americans from bombing. And of course, a large part of the tragedy of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos was precisely that the Americans bombed and bombed and bombed. The country I used to live in, Laos, is the most heavily bombed country in the history of the world. More bombs were dropped on Laos than were dropped on Germany during World War II. More bombs were dropped on Laos than were dropped on Japan during World War II. And Laos, in case you didn't know, is an incredibly tiny country. So this ongoing saturation bombing, the unchallenged use of aerial supremacy of airplanes in war, had this unbelievably devastating impact on these countries, and of course a body count of over 1 million persons. So, taking this longer view and having drawn attention to these strategic elements that Americans at the time ignored and that most people still today don't think about or don't know, death of Joseph Stalin, the cessation of hostilities in Korea, the importance of both Korea and Japan in prefiguring the American attitude. But for China, by contrast, the importance of Cambodia in prefiguring China's attitude. That China goes into this period from 1954 to 1979. China is supporting Cambodia and is an enemy of Vietnam. The whole Western world is ignoring this. They just don't care. The reality is China is not a genuine supporter of the North Vietnamese, despite propaganda to the contrary. And this is finally ultimately shown in open war between China and Vietnam. And this is what set the stage for the war to be possible, to unfold as it did. And it's what ultimately created the conditions for the war to end. How does the war end? Why does the war end? The war ends because Nixon comes to a pact with China. Nixon realizes the gravity and the depth of China's war with the Soviet Union. Now, it was a war technically. What can I call it? I can't call it a Cold War. The term Cold War is already taken. This was what created the strategic triangle, or some people call it the Iron Triangle, or use other names for it. But for the first time, the United States of America and Communist China would become strategic allies against Russia. Now, you can imagine the whole history of the world today would be different if Richard Nixon had instead chosen to become an ally with the Russians against China. Fundamentally, the reason for Nixon's decision had to do with his face-to-face relationships. Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower, and in that period, Nixon had many face-to-face diplomatic interactions with the Russians, including a visit of the Russian leader to the United States, where Nixon was really the guy who spent a lot of time with him and his entourage. I think partly just because Eisenhower was more elderly and so on. Nixon knew the Russians face-to-face for basically his whole political career. And indeed, looking back now, you really have to wonder, especially given this is the relatively optimistic post-Stalinist period, why didn't Nixon instead get into an alliance with the Russians against the Chinese? Well, as you guys probably know, the alliance between the United States of America and China began with a ping pong match. This is the part that makes it into the textbooks. The ping pong match led to secret face-to-face meetings between elite-level leaders in China and the United States of America. Ultimately, Nixon and his wife personally go to China, meet with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and seal this strategic pact that would go on to cost yet more millions of lives. This would be peace, but peace paid for in blood to a ridiculous extent. Nixon understands that the Chinese are fundamentally enemies of the Russians, the Chinese are fundamentally enemies of the Vietnamese, and the linchpin it all turns on is Cambodia. And that is why the Vietnam War ends with the commencement of hostilities of unbelievable intensity in Cambodia. And in those hostilities, the surreal fact of the matter is the United States of America and the communist Pol Pot regime are on the same side because they represent the pro-Chinese side fighting against the pro-Russian side, as basically Vietnam and Laos decided to remain loyal to Russia rather than switching their allegiance to Mao Zedong and China. So an unbelievably bloody exercise in which millions of people were killed. The most fundamental error of all was that the Americans went into this long series of wars with the mentality of us versus them. They never really had a mentality of democracy versus dictatorship. They never had a mentality of human rights versus despotism. The agenda that the United States operated on, and under the leadership of really old school warmongers who had lived through World War II and had lived through the Korean War, I think they genuinely had the delusion that if they could just conquer Vietnam enough, after the regime change, like Japan, the whole country would be transformed into a business-friendly, pro-American democracy. They were not willing to entertain the depressing possibility that Japan was not the example that proves the rule, but Japan was the exception that proves the rule.